Hello and welcome to Friday in October. I'm
Welcome.
Michael Haley Goldman. I am the Executive Director of New Hampshire Humanities, and I'm really excited to be with you tonight, along with Professor Robert Goodby. This is the Humanities to Go Online program for the month of October. We will be coming back with more in November, so we hope you'll join us for that. But without further ado, I want to introduce Professor Robert Goodby, who is a professor of anthropology at Franklin Pierce University in Rindge. He holds a PhD in anthropology from Brown University and has spent the last 30 years studying Native American archaeological sites in New England. He is the past president of New Hampshire Archaeological Society, a former trustee of the Mount, I'm going to make sure I say this anywhere close to correct, the Mount Kearsarge Indian Museum in Warner, and served on the New Hampshire Commission on Native American Affairs. In 2010, he directed the excavations of 4 20,000-year-old Paleo-Indian dwelling sites at the Tennant Swamp site in Keene. The talk tonight is called Deep Presence, and I'm looking forward to hearing it as much as all of you. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Bob.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for everybody who has come out this evening. My name is Bob Goodby. I'm an archaeologist, and I work primarily in New Hampshire on Native American sites, and I'm very happy to be doing this talk tonight. The talk is going to have a couple of parts to it. I'm really focusing on sort of introducing the book that has just been released from the publisher, called A Deep Presence, and it's in part a summary of the last 22 years of work I've done in the Monadnock region of southwestern New Hampshire. It's been a very interesting project writing the book, and so I'm going to talk about how the book came to be, what kind of book it is, and then look at the different chapters of the book. But as I look at those chapters, each one of those is going to provide a doorway into some aspect of the Native American past here in New Hampshire, and then sort of bring it around to what I think is a hopeful and optimistic conclusion here. So I have been doing this for a long time. I fell in love with archaeology when I was an undergraduate at the University of New Hampshire, and I first fell in love with the discipline of anthropology, and in the United States, archaeology is embedded within that discipline. And of the different parts of anthropology, archaeology I didn't quite grab me as I was studying it in the classroom. But the summer of my sophomore year, I had an opportunity to work on a Native American site in New Hampshire, up by Lake Winnipesaukee. And I was troweling away and I found a stone spear point. And the director came over and she could tell from the style that it was about 7,000 years old. And I just had this epiphany at that point and knew this was all I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And the epiphany was a two-part one. The first was thinking, as many people do when something like that happens, that I'm the first person in 7,000 years to have touched this object, and there's something that's exciting about that. But it's the second part of it that made me an archaeologist, and that is really what's up with this book, which is how do you use these objects to go back in time and learn about a history that has been made invisible, and then bring that out of the darkness and into the present so that people are aware of it, because that's what archaeology is. It's not about finding old objects. It's about restoring and recreating a human story. And that's the part of it that excites me most of all. So that's how I got going in this funny business. And so I was a good archaeologist. I did lots of digs, did lots of studies, and I wrote lots of very technical scientific papers published in journals that would be read by a small number of my peers, and got ahead in the field as I was supposed to do. But then about 15 years ago, something interesting and exciting changed for me. I became involved with the New Hampshire Humanities to Go program. And that's a gem in the state of New Hampshire. It allows scholars from all sorts of backgrounds to bring their work to public audiences. And I began doing talks all over the state and did them in, just a second here. Okay, did them in places ranging from this beautiful old meeting house in North Sutton, New Hampshire. It's from a talk I did this past summer, to what was probably my most unusual venue, which was the New Hampshire State Prison in Berlin. And I've done lost count, but easily a few hundred of these talks. And in doing so, I had to communicate about archaeology in a different way. And I have this quote from one of my favorite archaeologists, Jim Dietz, who wrote books for a general public audience. And as he says here, archaeologists really are storytellers. It's the nature of our work. I mean, we're digging and we're finding objects, but those objects tell a story that has a chronology, it has a timeline, a beginning, a middle, a conclusion. It has odd plot twists. It has mysteries that archaeologists can see and can explain. And if you deliver it in the right way, it's incredibly engaging. And so having the opportunity to speak to these audiences, I had a tremendous amount of fun. And not only talking about archaeology in a different way, but also getting feedback from the audience and hearing their perspective. And it's something that I still do and is really been a big part of the book. And I do two talks for New Hampshire Humanities. One is digging into Native history in New Hampshire, which is sort of a general overview. And then the second really focuses on what's probably the best site I'll ever work on, the site we found before the construction of the new middle school in Keene, New Hampshire. And that one's called 12,000 Years Ago in the Granite State. And both of those talks are in this book very prominently. But it's also allowed me to bring in all sorts of other things that I've never had room to talk about or include. And in the writing of the book, that was a learning experience. I began to see patterns and things that I hadn't seen when everything was broken up into different talks or different projects. And so it was a really neat experience. This is not a typically scientific book. I present a lot of scientific information, but it's written for the most part in the first person. And as I was writing it, I realized that I was telling stories, and one story was the story of the Abenaki, the native people of New Hampshire. And in New Hampshire, we are in the heart of Indokina, the traditional homeland of the Abenaki people. But as I was telling that story in a first person voice, I also realized I was telling my story, sort of a memoir of how I got into this strange field and the way I got excited about it, and stories about how individual sites were discovered and how we put the pieces together to learn what was up with them. And a lot of what's in the book, the story involves my students at Franklin Pierce University, who you can see in these pictures. I have been teaching at Franklin Pierce for 22 years now. It is a small school that traditionally has been centered on the liberal arts. And so in the teaching of archaeology, I didn't have to be in a big auditorium as a distant figure on a stage. I had small groups of students, and I was able, as part of teaching them, to take them out in their freshman year and have them work on sites and give them the chance that I had when I first discovered this field, and see if this was something that would really engage them. So most of what's in this book, it's either work my students have done or in some way work my students were involved in. And then as I was doing all this and being a good archaeologist and writing my scientific papers, my wife kept telling me, you should write a book. You should write a book. And this past year, the combination of having a sabbatical at Franklin Pierce and also the general lockdown from COVID, this was the perfect opportunity to do that. But when I sat down to think about it, I really didn't have much interest in writing a highly technical book that was going to be read by 10 of my colleagues. And what I really wanted to do was write a book in the vein of the talks that I did for New Hampshire Humanities. And so that's what I did. And I first started by looking at my wife, who's an English professor, and saying, what do I do? And she said, very patiently, she said, what you need is a scaffold. And that's what writers call it when you first begin a book project. And in Keene, we've had this wonderful project called the Wall Dogs project, where beautiful murals have been painted on old buildings downtown. This one focusing on the Abenaki. And so there we have it, a scaffold as the Abenaki mural is going up. And so I sat down with a legal pad and sketched out a table of contents. And the final table of contents in the book looks a heck of a lot like that legal pad did. And so that part was easy. I knew the pieces I wanted to talk about. I knew how I wanted to talk about them. And then I just started to write. And that process was pretty easy too. And so within 2.5, 3 months, I had a manuscript, and things were in good shape. Turns out that was the easy part. Okay, not having published a book before, I only had sort of a vague understanding of the modern publishing landscape, and it turns out that landscape has changed an awful lot in the last 20 years or so, with the rise of the internet and virtual competition for people's reading time. Publishers are selling fewer books, and there are fewer bookstores. And one of the consequences of that is that publishers are very reluctant to publish books sort of on spec from authors who do not have an established track record of being commercially successful. And so what many publishers require these days is what's called subvention, which means that once the publisher has looked at the manuscript and decided it's worthy of publication, the author has to find financial backing for the project so that the publisher doesn't assume the risk. And I was like, oh, how am I going to do this? I ruled out bake sales, and some of my more tech savvy friends said, well, you should do a GoFundMe campaign. And as someone who still uses a track phone, I didn't think that was a very good idea. And then I thought to myself that in the 20 years I'd been working in the Monadnock region, I had worked with some outstanding nonprofit organizations. And so I approached two of them, the Harris Center and the Historical Society of Cheshire County, gave them a copy of the manuscript and asked for their support. And in a little while, both organizations were on board. And so I was very pleased by that, and we were on the way. I also got some assistance from Franklin Pierce University. And with that in place, I could now go looking for a publisher. And one of the first places I went was a local New Hampshire publisher, Peter E. Randall Publisher out of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And I knew of them because one of the things they specialize in are books on local history. And I had actually published a chapter in one of these books that was done, oh goodness, more than 20 years ago. And so when I approached them, they looked at the manuscript and they were also excited. And so everything had sort of come together. I finished the book late spring. It went through editing, and the books came from the printer about 3.5 weeks ago. So they are now live, they are out, and I am now in the book promotion business, as you can tell here this evening. So that's the story of the book. One of the things that was important about it, because archaeology it's a very visual discipline. You need to be able to see the objects that you're thinking about and writing about. And if you're doing a book on archaeology, you have to have a lot of photographs. Now that's a good thing, but it's also a challenge because it's expensive to publish a book with a lot of color photographs, but we wanted the photographs to be of top quality. So you can see a couple examples here. This beautiful ash splint hamper on the left. One of the things the Abenaki are renowned for are their wood splint baskets, which began mostly as utilitarian baskets, but as they as the tourists began flowing into New Hampshire during the late 19th century, there was a ready market for white tourists who had sort of Victorian era tastes for things with lots of ornamentation. And so the Abenaki and other native people began producing these very elaborate, very beautiful baskets that today are in art museums and fetch lots of money at auction houses. On the other end of the time spectrum, this is an 11 to 12,000 year old Paleo-Indian fluted point from New Hampshire, sort of bracketing these two periods. And on the cover of the book, I have a wonderful illustration. One of my partners in this has been a teacher at the Keene Middle School, Miranda Nelkin, who is a wonderful illustrator and artist. And she took the archaeological information from that ancient site in Keene that I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. And from that came up with an imagined depiction of what this encampment may have looked like. And that graces the front cover of the book. Okay. So the book begins with an introduction. And as I realized that I was telling these two stories simultaneously, I sort of embraced that. This picture on the left, fortunately, does not appear in the book, but that is a much earlier version of yours truly from my second summer in archaeology, when I worked on a spectacular site right at the base of Amoskeag Falls in the heart of downtown Manchester. And you can see the highway in the background here as I'm screening. And so in that chapter, I talk about how I got into the field, and I also talk about some of the things that we've lost. And if you look at this aerial photo of downtown Manchester, right by Amoskeag Falls, you can see the devastation that industrialization has brought about. And so often with the archaeology here, we are chasing after the tiny little fragments that have survived all the ravages of the last 200 years. And that's part of the reality of what we do. The second chapter, I took on a question that a lot of people are interested in. So in doing this work, I have a lot of non-native people in New Hampshire say, oh, that's really interesting. And then the first question they ask is, it's not who are the native people, but the question is almost always phrased, who were the native people? As if they're somehow gone and that story has come to an end. And so in this chapter, I spend a little time sort of unpacking that, because most people, when they think of that question, all they're really looking for is a name. They think of native people as being organized into tribes, and so they want a tribal name. And once they have their name, that's usually where it stops. But the reality of native people was and is a lot more complicated than that. The native societies of New England were not separated by hard and fast borders, by the dark black lines that people draw on a map. Instead, they were really characterized by commonality and connections. They spoke dialects that were mutually intelligible. They traveled to meet each other. They were intermarried. They had very similar material culture. And so thinking about this question of identity, I found that the connections were far more important than any divisions. And I sort of lay that out there and try to give a sense of what that means. The next chapter's a long one for this book. And this is where I really dive into the evidence that we're finding. What are the artifacts like? What are the sites like? What has preserved? And one of the things that preserves very well are stone tools. And so archaeologists make as much of them as they possibly can. One of the things we're interested in is where the native people got the stone from, because it has to be a very high quality to make these sorts of tools. And so I talk about sites like the famous quarry outside of Berlin, New Hampshire, where native people took out so much stone from the top of the mountain that they created a cave. And I talk about pottery, which is one of my favorite forms of material culture, and how expressive that is, and how the designs reflect all sorts of cultural choices made by the native women who made these. And I talk about things like the rivers and streams and lakes of New Hampshire, and how these were not only the focus of native settlement, but also the roads and highways that these people used as part of being connected to other native people over a very, very broad area. So looking at things like this dugout canoe as a reflection of that. I then talk about foresights that I really focus on to try to bring some of these themes out. And they're not laid out in chronological order, but it just seemed like the way to present them. I start with a site in Swansea, New Hampshire, just south of Keene. And the focus of this site is this remarkable dam in the Ashwillet River. And the first European settlers here saw that, and they called it the Old Indian Dam. But my fellow archaeologists had never documented this kind of substantial stone structure by native people in northern New England. So there was a lot of skepticism about it. And so I made it the focus of my first field school with Franklin Pearson, worked on it on and off for the next 10 years after that. And we were able to demonstrate that this dam was absolutely built by Native Americans. And we found artifacts and radiocarbon dates that put its construction 4,000 years before present, and showed that it was in continual use all the way up until the time of European contact. And it illustrates one of the themes that you see not only in the Monadnock region, but all around New England. The native people were what anthropologists call hunters and gatherers. They moved around from season to season. And so the English came here and they said, they don't really live here. They just wander around. They're just nomadic. But they were not nomadic because they would return to the same places year after year, generation after generation, so that in areas like Swansea, New Hampshire, there's 12,000 years of continuous native presence there, 400 generations. And it continues into the time of European contact. And this is one site that illustrates that sort of thing. The second site I talk about is in a way sort of a prosaic site. It's sort of an average day in the life of Native people. It's in Peterborough, New Hampshire, and it was on a small knoll next to a brook, the Nubanusset, and an area of wetlands. And it was a place not where Native people lived for days or weeks, but where they would come to do a day's work, trapping beaver, collecting plants out of the wetlands, fishing. And we had evidence not only of beaver bone, but the remains of 3 different species of turtle that were identified. I see on the Zoom here that one of the folks in the audience is my colleague Tanya Largy, who did all of the analysis for this. So we find these sorts of things, we ship them off to experts, and they get identified. But if this is a site where people just came for an afternoon or day to work, what's going on here? Where did they go at night? Where did they live? And the answer to that, I think you have to look at the broader area. The Nubanusset flows southward. It joins the Contoocook River, and that would have been the perfect place for a village site to have been. A nice level terrace where 2 rivers come together. It's the kind of place Native people really liked. And it's also right in the heart of downtown Peterborough, New Hampshire, covered with asphalt, modern buildings, sewer pipes, the remains of a railroad that went through in the 19th century, and there's nothing left. So that if we're going to learn about that, we can't focus on that spot. We have to go upstream to this site and see what we can tease out here and restore at least some of the picture of what was. The third site I look at is a really remarkable one. This is down in the very southwest corner of New Hampshire on the banks of the Connecticut River, and it's on the edge of Wentasticket Mountain. And what we had here was the remnant of a large river terrace that was actively eroding into the Connecticut River. And you can see our excavations here, and you can see the active erosion right next to us. And what we had for a setting here was initially a large terrace coming out from the New Hampshire side of the river. So this map right here is a topographic map from 1893, and it shows these 2 big islands. The geology says that the soil on these islands is identical to the soil on the New Hampshire side, but different from the soil on the Vermont side. So these were initially part of New Hampshire coming out from the base of Wentasticket Mountain like that. By the time you get up to this modern topographic map, almost all those islands are gone. Just natural erosion and the construction of the Vernon Dam a couple miles downstream. Probably the 1938 hurricane didn't help a whole lot. And all of that, just about all of that is gone, except for this tiny little strip of terrace that's clinging onto the side of the mountain. And so our goal here was simply to save what was there before it was gone. And what we ended up finding was a very rich site with distinct layers of artifacts going down over 3 feet. And we had artifacts and radiocarbon dates that went from about 700 years ago to 5,000 years ago. And then these intriguing little vertebrae that in the hands of the right people were identified as snake vertebrae, the majority of which were coming from the timber rattlesnake. And to this day, the top of Wentasticket Mountain is one of the last refuges of the eastern timber rattlesnake in New Hampshire. And we have evidence here that Native people were using these continuously for 5,000 years because these bones are found all the way down through every layer of the site. And then we get to ask questions that are important to ask but hard to answer. Was this just food? There's a lot of evidence that rattlesnakes were sacred to Native people. Okay, could it have been both? How do you make that sort of distinction? And the final site I look at is the one in Keene that I mentioned. And like I said, this is probably the site of a lifetime for me. It's discovered before the construction of the new middle school. And what we found were 4 clusters of artifacts. And after careful excavation and mapping, these clusters turned out to be oval in shape. And what they were the sites where 4 different tents had been set up during the Paleo-Indian period, the very first period of human occupation here. And so people erected a tent, and it was very similar, I think, to this tent built by Inuit people in northern Canada about 100 years ago. There was a small fire in the middle, and we found small fragments of burned bone where that fire should have been. And then around the fire, there's a work area where people are making tools and preparing food and things of that sort. And we had this dense cluster of artifacts. And then people would sleep up against the wall of the tent. And we had the entire layout of these 4 different times on a site with a radiocarbon date of 12,600 years before present, as close as you're going to come to seeing the very first human beings to come into New England. So a remarkable chance to travel that far back in time. And with these maps, almost walk into somebody's house and ask all kinds of nosy questions about what they did and where they did it and how their houses differed from their neighbors. It was just a remarkable opportunity. So I talked quite a bit about that site. The book has a conclusion, 2 pages long, so I'll just tell you it has a conclusion and focus on the chapter that comes before it, because too many archaeologists sort of stop their work with the arrival of the Europeans. And too many people who are not native have this idea that the Abenaki or other native people in New England are gone, extinct, and part of the past. But the reality is much more interesting and much more complicated. And so I wanted to address that at the end of the book. The Abenaki, like most native people, have a very challenging time in the 17th and 18th century. They're devastated by diseases. They're caught up in wars between the French and the English, and it's a period of tremendous violence and population loss and loss of culture to some extent. It's a very, very difficult time, and those difficulties continue all the way into the 20th century. The Abenaki begin to keep a very low profile, so it's very easy not to see them in New Hampshire. Some of them moved to Quebec to live with their French allies. Others just keep out of sight and keep the fact that they're Indian very well hidden. But in the Keene area, there's a remarkable story from the end of the 19th century. A family of Abenaki Indians from living in the village of Odenak in Quebec decides to move. They get in a canoe and come down the Connecticut River and end up settling in Keene. And that back and forth between New Hampshire and Quebec is something that has gone on for centuries. It was the Sedekis family, Israel Sedekis and his wife, Mary. They settle in Keene and they raise a family of 12 children. And in this beautiful picture, this is their youngest child, their youngest daughter, Elizabeth Sedekis. This is her high school graduation photo. And Israel made a living in Keene making and selling baskets. It's a very traditional Abenaki task. And the entire family was known as Keene's Indians and were very popular and embraced by the community. But even here, you see this specter of making Native history invisible come in. One of the documents I include is a copy of Elizabeth's birth certificate from 1897, which is a remarkable document. It's a typical birth certificate. And at the top, it identifies her father, Israel, and it gives his color as Indian, color meaning race. It identifies her mother, Mary Watso Sedekis, and gives her color as Indian. And yet Elizabeth's color is given as white. So how does that happen? Well, the family story is that because the Sedekises were so well liked and so popular, the people at the hospital assumed they were doing them a favor by removing Elizabeth's Indian identity. So all the way up to the 20th century, this sort of thing continues. And it's a tough story, but the last 30 years has seen a renaissance of Abenaki culture as the Abenaki themselves have revitalized their language, have come out of the shadows, become politically active, And it is we're moving in a very positive direction. So my final photo in the book is of my friend Sherry Gould, who's a master Abenaki basket maker, and it's Sherry teaching this craft and keeping it alive. And I think that's an important lesson that comes out of all of this. So that is the book. I had a lot of help from a lot of people to put it all together, and I'm not going to spend all the time it would take to read everybody's names here, but it's colleagues, it's students, it's people in the community, it's museums who all contributed to this. So as I said, the book is out, and you can get it in a number of places, and it has so far been very well received. We've actually sold a surprising number of copies, and just yesterday made the decision already to go to a second printing. So things are moving in a very positive direction. And so that's my formal presentation, and I'd be happy to take any questions that we have. Michael's going to be doing the moderating, and so yeah, I'd be very interested to see what you have to say.
Thanks, Bob. And yeah, I think it's really important to pardon me for a second. It's very important for me to kind of encourage people to go ahead and either raise your hands or to put some notes in the chat, and I can read off your questions if you would prefer that. I have a lot of questions. I think you've kind of given us enough of an outline that there are all kinds of intriguing kind of details that you've kind of alluded to that I'd love to hear more details on. So just to kind of, while people are making sure that you find how to actually raise your hand if you want to do that, or find the chat, that's going to be on your bottom bar. If you scroll down to the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a chat feature or a reactions feature, which will allow you to raise your hands. So please start looking for those. But I'm going to go ahead and kick us off with a question. One of the things, Bob, that I think is really interesting is you are writing about the Abenaki from an archaeologist perspective, as a non-member of that community. What does that mean to be from that perspective and writing about this community?
Yeah, that's a good question. And 30 or 40 years ago, archaeologists never thought of that. We were just doing our archaeology, and that was all there was to it. In New England, where most people had thought that there were no intact Native communities left, we didn't really have a living constituency to answer to. But that began to change about 30, 35, 40 years ago, as Native people were reasserting their presence here. And one of the things they were concerned with was how their culture and how their history was being depicted, especially since so much of what appeared in books and in libraries was in no way controlled by them. So that is an issue. Now, I have, for the past 25 years, worked very closely with Native people on a number of things. I've helped with the repatriation or return of ancestral remains for reburial. I've worked on them with museum exhibits, and served on the New Hampshire Commission on Native Affairs and things of that sort. All that has been very important, and it's enhanced my understanding of things, but that doesn't mean that I'm writing with a Native voice. I'm not. And I say early on in this book that what I am presenting is my version of their history, as I have learned it as an archaeologist and as I understand it. And I think if you're going to do that, particularly writing about the past of people who for so long have been ignored, I think it's important to do it with good faith. And I've tried to do that in this book, to write as honest and sympathetic an account as I can without straying away from the facts. I mean, a lot of what I write about is either grounded in or inspired by the facts as I see them in archaeology. So I am very anxious to see what my Abenaki friends think about the book. I've heard from a couple of them, and so far so good. But yeah, that is an important issue.
I don't want to mute it. I unmuted it by doing the.
Yeah, and I apologize. I just muted you back. I wasn't clear if you had intended to mute there. So just let me know if that was a mistake. While you're thinking about that, I'm going to put a question in from Eric, who wants to know if there were other Indians in New Hampshire beyond the Abenaki, and if there are archaeological digs documenting other tribes in New Hampshire.
Yeah, good question. In my opinion, I'm going to do two things. One is I'm going to say no, this is Abenaki homeland. And that's from my understanding of what we know about the historic period. There are a couple of things that complicate that. If you go back 5,000 years ago, or 8,000 years ago, I think in a general sense, those people were the ancestors of the Abenaki, because I see no evidence that the region was ever abandoned. I don't see any evidence of an invasion from outside. What I see is a lot of continuity. But that doesn't mean that 8,000 years ago, people were speaking the same Abenaki language that was spoken in the 1600s when Europeans arrived. And it doesn't mean that the culture of these people was the same as it was in the 1600s. Human beings change, their cultures change, and it doesn't matter who they are. So taking the term Abenaki as we've learned it in the last few centuries and, putting it on people from 8,000 years ago, there's more to it than that. But I definitely do think there's that ancestral connection there. There are some archaeologists, as far as other tribes in New Hampshire, the only real argument that's been made about that is there is some pottery from northern New Hampshire that is similar to pottery being made by Iroquoian-speaking people up in the St. Lawrence drainage. And some archaeologists have suggested, oh, maybe the St. Lawrence Iroquois were down here. I have for 30 years been skeptical about how you can read ethnicity from pottery in this part of the world. That was actually what I did my doctoral dissertation on. So I'm skeptical about that argument. And for the most part, this is the Abenaki homeland.
So there's another interesting question from David, who is asking, it is actually kind of one of the bigger questions in terms of when people came to the North American area. So the question is, have you noticed a change in public awareness of when humans first arrived in what is now the west coast of the US? And do you have ideas about how long it took for them to come east to the Keene area?
Yeah, boy. That used to be such a simple question to answer when I first got into this field. And my first 7 or 8 years of teaching, I gave my students a very simple story about when the first people came here that I now know is wrong. The old idea was you had a single migration over the Bering Land Strait, maybe 13,000 years ago, the Bering Land Bridge, forgive me. And then people sort of spread down into the Americas. And so the people in New Hampshire are part of that migration. That story held up until the late 1980s, early 1990s. And they were finding sites in South America that were earlier than the supposed entry of people over the land bridge. And so that doesn't work anymore. And that is now in North American archaeology a wide open question. We're not sure when the first migrations come. We're open to the idea that there were multiple migrations, including migrations from areas other than Siberia down through Alaska. It's a little bit simpler in this part of the world because we know that New England was covered with a glacier until 18,000 years ago, and New Hampshire probably wasn't habitable until about 15,000 years ago. So we don't have the issues of anything before then. But yes, complicated, wide open question. Very interesting stuff.
Can I ask a question?
Is that you, Carol? Yes. Go ahead, Carol.
Yep. First of all, there's two questions. One of is, are you aware of how they organize themselves? We give American Indians sometimes credit for being quite democratic. I'm wondering if you have any knowledge of their organization in that way, of their tribal life.
Yeah, good question. And it's very hard to see that in the archaeology. It really is.
Right.
It's very hard even to see on a single site sort of what the boundaries of a community at one point in time would have been. Mm-hmm. And to be able to estimate how many people lived on a site at that single point in time. I think my best approach to that would be from what we know about the Abenaki in the historic period and the modern period, and also what anthropology tells us about small-scale human societies in general. And that is that they were, in a sense, very democratic. They were egalitarian. They did not have leaders with the power to coerce other people. And decisions were made consensually. Everybody got a voice, but people with more experience on a particular issue, their voice might carry greater weight. And so in that sense, comparatively, yeah, they were what we would call fairly democratic.
Mhm.
And I think that is probably true of their ancestors going back thousands of years. I would assume that's true, but the archaeology is a blunt instrument to be able to see that.
Are there Abenaki people who take some responsibility for speaking as Abernakis to other people?
Oh,
Are there
absolutely.
leaders and people we could be in contact with?
Yes, absolutely.
Mhm.
There are a number of well-organized Abenaki communities right now. 4 of them have achieved state recognition from the state of Vermont. There are communities here in New Hampshire, and within those communities, there are people who take leadership roles. So yes, very much so.
And how does one find out? I live in the Laconia area in the Lakes region, and I'm just wondering who I have in the past been in contact with several people, but I've lost contact with them. I'm just wondering, are you a source to help me find such people?
Yeah. I could be a source, but I'm actually going to run away from that question as fast as I can. And the reason being, knowing something about the political landscape of the Abenaki here, I don't want to be pointing to 1 or 2 or 3 communities and saying, go to these people.
Okay, I understand that.
I'm going to punt on that one, but I would say if you want to contact Abenaki organizations, Abenaki leaders, you could do that either through the New Hampshire Commission on Native American Affairs. They would be able to help you. And also the Mount Kearsarge Indian Museum has become a real cultural center for Abenaki people.
Oh, yes, I've been there. Yes.
Yes, and they would be able to put you in touch with people in the community as well.
Right. Thank you.
And while you're talking about the community, one of the questions farther down kind of fits into this is how large is the Abenaki community today in New Hampshire?
Yeah, I would be hard pressed to put an exact number on it, but I'm guessing there are many hundreds, probably a few thousand people who very much identify as being Abenaki. They are not in one single group or organization. Some of them belong to some of these smaller, loosely organized groups. Some of them are just individual people out there on the landscape. But that number is growing. And one of the reasons it's growing is one of the ways the Abenaki survived all the horrible persecution and discrimination they experienced was by hiding the fact, it's very painful, but hiding the fact that they were Native from their own children. And so I've worked with a lot of Abenaki people who didn't find out that they had Native ancestry until they were in their 30s or 40s. And then they have to do the work of saying, okay, now, so what does that mean to me? How do I reconnect that? How do I sort of rebuild that? And as we have made more of an opening for Native people, and there's been more support and acceptance, that number is growing rapidly. So.
Another question is from Kate, and she was asking about whether your archaeological digs discovered seeds or objects that identified Native foodways.
Yeah, good question. One of the problems we have here is our preservation tends to be pretty poor. Our soils are typically shallow, and they're also very acidic, so a lot of organic things don't survive well here. There are some exceptions to that. If plant materials have been in a fire and they've been carbonized, they can survive and they still retain enough shape so that in the hands of an expert, they can identify what kinds of seeds they are. And it's not uncommon to find nuts in archaeological sites. And this was an important food source, and butternuts, hickory nuts, acorns, et cetera, et cetera. So we do have some insight into that. There are also smaller seeds like Quinopodia that have been recovered. But these were important foods, but they're a little harder to see than, say, things like deer that have very large and very recognizable bones that might survive.
Next question I've got is from Gary, who wanted to know if you've been involved in any digs on the seacoast.
Yeah. I have done some work on the seacoast, and actually my I was an undergraduate at the University of New Hampshire, so I was in Durham, so I was pretty close to the seacoast. And the archaeology lab at UNH when I was there was chock full of artifacts that had been excavated before the construction of the Seabrook nuclear power plant. And the entire Hampton estuary in that region is an incredibly rich archaeological area. And there are sites going back thousands of years. But as sea level has risen, not only in recent years, but over the last 5,000 or 6,000 years, a lot of those sites that were once on dry land are now sort of incorporated into the salt marsh. That makes them hard to excavate, but also it makes things preserve better than they might in other sorts of environments. And I actually did my master's thesis looking at sites on the New Hampshire coast that had evidence for very long distance interaction between about 1,500 and 2,000 years ago. So yeah, that is a very rich area. I think you're muted. Yeah.
Yeah, that's I'm trying to keep the dog still at the same time and missed the button. Sorry about that. Is there evidence? This is a question from Carolyn. And is there evidence that Native people lived around most or all of the large bodies of water in New Hampshire? Where else did they live? Were they more present than might have been portrayed in U.S. history publications?
I think they were definitely more present. And I think it's very easy to underestimate the number of people who were here, just as it's easy to underestimate that they were here at all. And as far as we understand it, the waterways really were the focus. And that makes sense in a lot of ways. I mean, people need fresh water. There's a lot of food in lakes and rivers and things of that sort. And excuse me, the rivers and streams were also their highways. It was how they traveled. And so disproportionately, that's where we find their sites. Now that becomes a little bit of a problem for archaeologists, because since we almost always find sites when we're digging next to major rivers or waterfalls, if someone asks us, well, what about this area up in the uplands that's typical New Hampshire rocky upland terrain? And we'll say, oh, well, we don't really think the Native people were there, so it's not worth doing any work. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. In reality, we don't have a great understanding of how Native people use those upland locations because so much of what we've done has focused on the rivers and lakes.
There's a question from David about the old canoe found in Laurel Lake and how old was it? And are there similar vessels to be found?
Yes.
How old would they have been?
Okay. Yeah, good question. There are a number of dugout canoes that have emerged from the bottoms of lakes and ponds in New Hampshire. The large majority of them are made of white pine, and some of them can be pretty decent in size. There are a handful of them that have been radiocarbon dated. And every one that has been radiocarbon dated, those dates are either firmly in the historic period after European contact, or they extend into the historic period. We have yet to find a canoe that is unequivocally before European contact. And that's a little bit of a problem, because when Europeans came here, they made use of and imitated so many things that the Native people were doing. They used their trails and turned them into roads because they were the best way to get across the landscape. And they made dugout canoes and they used birch bark canoes. And it's very hard to tell if you have a canoe that was made in 1780 or 1850, if that was done by an Abenaki or by a European. The one in Laurel Lake is very interesting. I have not gotten a radiocarbon date on it, but when it was recovered in the 1960s, there are actually two canoes that came out of the lake at the same time. And the accounts of the people who brought them up said that they were attached by a plank. They were tied together by a plank that was nailed into the canoes. Okay, now that suggests that the canoes are also historic. So that's where we stand with that. That's what we know about most of them, including the Laurel Lake one. Now, that doesn't mean, even if they're only 200 years old, that doesn't mean that they weren't native, either that, made by native people or modeled after native canoes. Either way, I think they show the presence and the influence of the Abenaki.
Steven sent me a message asking about talking about the Abenaki as a nation or a tribe. I've realized I use the word community. What is the right way of referring to the Abenaki as a group? And what is the difference between the different terms?
Yeah, good question. Usually, there are a couple ways you could do that. A lot of times the term tribe is used to talk about Native people who are federally recognized, who have federal recognition. And there are no federally recognized tribes in either Vermont or New Hampshire. Now you get into Maine, and there are some Eastern Abenaki groups like the Penobscot that have federal recognition, and so from a legal standpoint can be talked about as tribes. But when you're talking about the Western Abenaki in New Hampshire or Vermont, the term is used just sort of as a generic catch-all for Indians who share a lot in common. So tribe means Indians, and so we think of the Abenaki as a tribe, even though they are not centrally organized. The thing from an anthropological point of view that really unites them is language and culture. So when anthropologists talk about the Western Abenaki, we're talking about people who spoke those dialects or carried that culture. But not the sense of a tribe with a nice, neat boundary and people flying the Abenaki flag over their wigwams or something of that sort. It's more subtle and more complex than that.
There was a question from Lois about whether you've interviewed any of the Abenaki in Quebec whose ancestors moved into Quebec due to European incursion, and do you have any understanding of their stories about that diaspora?
I have not interviewed any of them. I have a lot of colleagues, both Abenaki colleagues and non-Abenaki colleagues that have worked up there, and I've learned a little bit about those communities. Those are important places. They're important not only because the Abenaki down here were in contact with them continuously, and going back to the Sedekis family in Keene as they're making and selling baskets in the Monadnock region, Israel Sedekis would from time to time go back up to Odanak, get materials, okay, get inspiration for things, bring them back. And those were the places where the Abenaki language and the Abenaki culture really remained in sort of the most cohesive form. One of the things that has been important about those communities is with the language. And just a year or two ago, we lost one of the elders from Odanak, a remarkable man named Ili Jobert. And Ili was one of only a handful of living native speakers of Abenaki, of Western Abenaki, someone who actually grew up speaking the language. And I met Ili in sort of the later years of his life at a conference as he was pleading with the younger generation of Abenaki and anthropologists to keep the language alive. Because when the last native speaker dies, the language is now technically extinct, and Western Abenaki is just about there. But one of the things Ili did was he worked with a man named Jesse Bruchak, and Jesse has studied this language with the elders at Odanak and become fluent in it. And he now runs and organizes Abenaki language training sessions all over northern New England. And so because of that presence in Odanak, the Abenaki who are down in this area are able to work on that sort of project. So.
to try to get in one more question before we close up for tonight. There's a question from Barb about whether there have been burial grounds that have been found, and if not, why not, or have they been found?
Yeah, wow. That's quite a question to end on. The answer is yes. We have found both burial grounds with multiple burials, and we found places where individual people are buried. That's something I talk about in the book. That was an important part of my developing as an archaeologist, and really coming to grips with the fact that I was not only studying objects in the soil, but I was dealing with a community of people who still had a strong interest in that. The treatment of native burials is the single biggest contentious issue between natives and archaeologists, because for years archaeologists were able to just dig these up whenever they felt like it, study them, make their careers on them, and you can learn a tremendous amount of scientific information from a human burial. But to the Abenaki, like most people, having someone from a conquering culture dig up their ancestors is an act of desecration. And in the last 30 years, there has been a growing dialogue between archaeologists and Native people, really brought about in large part by the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990, which required us to work with Native people to return things that had been dug up in the past, and also to consult on things that emerged in the present. So these days, whenever I start a project, I hope and pray that I do not find any human remains. And if I do, there's a process in place where the state archaeologist is notified, and immediate consultations begin with people in the Abenaki community. And I have worked on a handful of sites where that has been an issue. I've also been honored to be included in the reburial of a number of Abenaki remains in different places in New Hampshire. And I write about that in the book.
All right, thank you. Big thank you and applause, if you can do it silently from your own places, for Professor Robert Goodby. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. And all of this, there's so much more. I think there are a lot of questions out there we're not going to get to tonight, but so much. Thanks so much for being here. We do invite you to go to our website, nhhumanities.org, and you can find out about other projects that are coming up, other talks, sign up for the newsletter Human Ties, and learn about everything else that we're doing.